whose theories legitimately would make sense to the rest of the world, and what kind of formats those people have to follow in order to be, respected in such a way. So that led me to think about a lot of questions of, for example, in academic writing, hero is a term that I usually stay away from and I do not like particularly because of the idea of, heroes as being saviors. But if we understand heroes in terms of people's whose views are valued and whom we can look up to, then in that sense, there was a gap of heroes emerging from different contexts of the world. Now, what particularly helped me was Black feminist thought in trying to understand how they had witnessed struggles from the early 60s and even before that in different contexts, for example, the context of the US. So that is my background, that is my investigation. At this moment, I'm really trying to understand, what ways we can see legitimate efforts of people coming from their context, and we can really see them as a serious theory building or a serious approach to those lenses that we use to make sense of this world as researchers. So I wanted to say a little bit about the aspect of being heroes, for example. Now, being a hero would be the representation or the ways in which a person can be seized as a person who is a knowledge producer and who's the person that we can look up to, and their thoughts and their opinions are seen as legitimate, let's say, theory or something that people can use and has translatability in different contexts. Now, there have been in the past quite a few understandings of heroes related with women. For example, we see a woman as the powerful. For example, Michelle Wallace's work in the 60s, when she wrote a very and was heavily critiqued for her writing, when she critiqued the civil rights movement, and she talks about Black power and how it sidelined the efforts of Black women and those kinds of ideas. So in a sense, in her book, she critiques which is called Black Macho and the Myth of the Superwoman. She critiques the ways in which, if women, for example, Bell Hooks also talks about that, if we talk about the issues of women, usually the issues of white women were highlighted. And if we talked about, struggles of Black peoples, usually those struggles of the men were highlighted as if, it was a homogeneous group and did not exist in this increasingly complicated and complex world. So those were the dilemmas. They were seen, for example, Black women were seen as, having the ability to work outside and therefore somehow more empowered in that sense without understanding the complexities of different contexts. Now, if you look at the context of, let's say, South Asia, where Pakistan is also located, similar imageries, for example, Mother Earth, which is called Dharti Ma, or the sort of the shrouded, the respectable, the honorable woman that has to be a mother or has to be a sister or a daughter in a household. So those kinds of imageries are also created. Now, what this means is that women, again, are seen as, powerful, superhuman heroes, but at the same time, what Black feminists thought would actually, describe it as are hyper visible objects. They're visible, very much visible, but they're yet seen as objects. Now, my work, which is more focused on girls' education, but from the perspective of the mothers and their support mechanisms, is also highly controversial in the sense that if you look at international education, there have been highly critiqued, for example, ideas of girl power or girl effect, but not critiqued ideas of girls' educations that are currently in place. So what happens in this is that girls, again, are seen as a very decontextualized sort of human capital. You put money like a money pot, you put money in them and automatically that transforms the nation, that transforms the family, and that just changes the world all of a sudden. So again, a very hyper visible and in a sense, being a hero, but being an object seen as a hero. So that kind of ideologies. Now, like I say, if you wanted to be a hero, you would technically be seen as an object. But if you wanted to become a hero, the frameworks or the ways in which you could actually claim your space as a true hero, as somebody who's taken seriously, for example, you would have to go through, the different philosophies and theories in which these social issues have been conceptualized, and especially the intersections of feminist work with these. it's common knowledge that feminist theorists had a lot of pushback when they tried to work on this, and issues to be related with gender weren't actually taken as serious theory or philosophy at the very beginning of the feminist, for example, movements. But also things like, philosophical ideas, for example, Noddings talks about how Jane Roland Martin critiques the the ideas of Plato. For example, his recommendations for education, where he says that just by virtue of the particular sex that women have, they are not ill-equipped to become the guardians of the the state, in a sense that they would have access to that public space only if they had certain kind of traits. Now, these traits were usually the leadership styles that were associated with masculinity. So in a sense, then, in order to become a hero, you would have to essentially have those typical traits of a man. So you have to become a man to be seen as a hero. So those frameworks also were critiqued by feminist scholars. Some of this thinking kind of prevails in thinking around the public and private divide, for example. A lot of feminists do not see as much value in the private space as they see in the public space. So now what this means is that, if you were to consider a set of tasks that by virtue of the physiology and the structures, usually women are made to look after, if you don't see value in it, and if you don't hold, the gender accountable for it, then just by saying, brushing it under the rug doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. It's a task and it's a job. So some of the scholars have actually now talked about the importance of women, men, and others of participating and understanding the productive and the reproductive life of individuals. And this has been a very strong struggle within the Black feminist circles as well, to kind of claim that right. For example, the histories of eugenics and the sort of pushback of Black women against that kind of power. So in a sense that, state has to play a part. If the private is also seen as a serious sort of enterprise, then men, women, and others, and the state also become responsible to look after it, just as they would in terms of, the public space. Now, we see that if you think about, being a hero, we see that women are either seen as very strong and therefore homogenized, and therefore a false idea of, that strength, which is again in which women are seen as objects, or very fragile and very, clean and, something that can't very clean and is very honorable, that kind of sense. Both senses make them objects. Now, on becoming heroes, the frameworks or the ways in which we see value in the social activities, if theory was to be seen as a social activity, a social process, then there are no mechanisms in which women can actually fit, because in order to fit, they would have to essentially follow the masculine traits. Now, in this kind of background, an interesting case is that of Muslim women, for example. If you look at this image, usually if you talk about Islam or a Muslim woman, you would see shrouded images like this. Either it would be like this, or it would be a hijab with the face showing. But yet again, these imageries in which women wearing hijab are objectified are usually visible. So how do you understand? Saeed would say as an Orient, you would understand them, or general media would understand them as docile and subservient. And with subservience also comes silence. And therefore, again, the objectivity of these women, if their identities were related with their ethnicity. Now, there is some very interesting work on silences that has been done, in which this binary of silence as violence and voice as power has been challenged. For example, scholars argue that there are certain contexts where silence actually can be used by women as a strategic force of exuding power in a particular way. Power doesn't need to be only defined in the masculine power to sense, but actually it is diverse and it is seen in that sense. And some examples that are given are those of silent vigils and other ways. I, in some of my work, use silence in relation with voice as a strategy that women use at particular points in their times, rationally understanding what Freire would call the praxis in which they live, and understanding, thinking, reflecting, and acting in certain situations in a certain way, using silences when they are appropriate and using voice figuratively when that becomes more effective. Now, now these ideas, as we can see that in these ideas of that heroism, if we saw this as heroism of, this woman actually taken seriously, or feminist issues taken seriously, and if a Muslim woman is seen as docile and subservient, then it doesn't fit very well with some of the issues. For example, the Islamic feminist thinking work of Saba Mahmood, and she talks about the Islamic revival movement in Egypt, and she shows how usually the domains, the public domains that were seen as the spaces for men, for example, the mosques, were taken over by these Egyptian women, and they used this abiding by and sort of without any dissent, subservient to those principles of the religion, for example, of chastity, for example, of all of these issues, abiding by them, restricting their own kind of movement, etc., that a feminist, liberal feminist idea would see as freedom limiting. But at the same time, those were the people who led this revival movement by drawing on the resources, the literary resources of Islam, the resources that were available to them through Islam, using that language, that resource, to then revive this kind of movement. So those complexities and those contradictions, as one must say, are there and quite complex in when we understand the efforts and the visions of different women. Now, within this feminist context, and within the context especially in when we speak about Muslim women, the kind of argument that I'm thinking about, not posing, but actually thinking about, is if we understood heroism, especially in the context of academia, and we understood it as the ability to be taken seriously and to develop serious philosophy and theory, and that being the heroism, could we imagine that as being rooted in the places where women or gendered beings actually live? So a place-based feminist theory, and a theory that takes seriously, it's not just like saying that everyday life, the things that we do are actually theory, but actually seriously taking whatever is taken from those contexts and respecting it as we would a grand theory. And what kind of that perspective, what would that perspective look like? Because if we're talking about feminisms, how can we then fit that under an understanding of a theory? Can that be a broad principle? Or can that be particular fundamental ideas that we should abide by? These are complex issues, but I believe are very important, especially in a world that is extremely dynamic and changing very rapidly. So as I was reading for this discussion, I really loved what Hook said, and I think it appropriately talks about how different women actually have and should have the right, and they are theorizing. Like Hook said, she says she was theorizing when she was a child, even before she knew what theory actually meant. So she says, when our lived experience of theorizing is fundamentally linked to a process of self-recovery, of collective liberation, no gap exists between theory and practice. Indeed, what such experience make more evident is the bond between the two, the ultimately reciprocal processes wherein one enables the other. Now, for this particular paper, like I said, this draws on 12 interviews with mothers in a rural community in central Punjab, Pakistan, and it draws on the ideas, draws on the aspirations of mothers. So those particular questions about what was the benefit of education and how mothers revealed their aspirations and how they felt that education could actually, what were the benefits of education for their daughters in the future. So imagining alternative futures through those aspirations of education. So in analyzing that, what I aim to look at is how is it that theories of philosophy or their own theories of transformation are actually taking place in their own places and spaces. So this rural community is quite interesting, and which is why although I conducted research in multiple sites, I chose this one because there was a lot of, so there were changes, and the context itself was quite dynamic. For example, okay, so for example, the economy of the community is more agriculture based. So in the 1960s, there was a green revolution that came to Pakistan and other countries like India as well. So what happened in the green revolution was that they were genetically engineered seeds of rice and of wheat that were imported from abroad into Pakistan, and they were used, which yielded dwarf kind of crops which were more resistant to weather conditions. So this doubled and also produces agricultural excess in the country. But Pakistan did not have the capacity to genetically engineer this seed. And so what happened was they had to rely on importing this seed and also fertilizers and the machinery that was needed to deal with that growing kind of yield. So this eventually exacerbated the social inequalities in the context, because only the rich farmers who had the resources and the money could actually purchase this grain and also make use of this opportunity. Whereas those farmers who were poor actually became more poor because they no longer had access to all of this, and many of them lost their land. So you could see the reverberations of that context where there were social inequalities within the context. But also, like Freire said, within the struggle, then also, we see resistance emerging, and it's more strongly recognizable in context where there is, extreme inequalities. On the other hand, on the education kind of side of it, that was also very dynamically changing. So in 2010, Pakistan passed a resolution in which free education for children 15 to 16 years was made. This policy was kind of made. And what that meant was, slowly and gradually, these policies started, they were then materialized in different parts of Pakistan. So in Punjab, for example, there were there was differences in the ways that the policies and the policy interventions actually reached the different communities. So you could see that the parents were seeing that there was a change within the context, because there was an increased monitoring and evaluation kind of coming from the government for the school, the staff, and things were on the mend and improving considerably. And a lot of people that I spoke with, they were quite aware of this change. Now, this is also very interesting, because when we talk about theories, and if we see theories as something that can help us make sense of different situations in the world, but at the same time, theories are only the the job, or only coming from certain kind of theorists from certain parts of the world, then in a sense, those theories are frozen in time. But as we see, especially in the context of the pandemic, and especially in different cultural contexts like the one that I'm talking about, there is a dynamism there, because the situation is changing so rapidly. What we usually miss is that there's a lot of talk of context. For example, for COVID, we understand that it is rapidly changing our present and will also change our future. But there is less of an attention on how people change in these changing contexts, and then they adapt, and then they, integrate in these contexts and also navigate those contexts as well. So in that sense, when it is a time to sort of reflect on whose theory, and is it the people living and changing in those contexts who would be able to create that theory that would do justice to that changing context, for example? Or is it that we see theory in terms of those theorists that we have seen in the rest of the world? And it always takes me back to that question that Bruce Jans actually poses in some of his writings, and a paper where he says, can we imagine, and that's one of the questions at the end of my presentation actually, that there are places, if we said that theory was only a series theory, could only be produced if, let's say, we are more equitable in our approach and we say not people, then can we say that theory can only be produced in particular situations or particular contexts? So some context that would be habitable for theory generation. then why do we still cling to the theories that Freire, for example, presented in his times of exile, or Gramsci, for example, produced in his time of imprisonment? So in a sense, if we were able to disconnect that grandeur from the theory and understand it as being done in the practice of everyday life and seriously giving it that respect, then what would that kind of idea look like? And it's essentially, I think, important for feminist issues, especially those to do with contexts like the one I'm talking about. Now, that was really interesting because within the conversations and the aspirations that mothers shared with me, what I saw was this somehow theory of change or theory of transformation, which was envisioned in terms of those aspirations and those expectations from education of survival. Now, these aspirations were not unrealistic, that some of the authors would call it. They were well aware of the changing circumstances. They were well aware of the lack of opportunities, but yet they were struggling towards something that was perhaps would not be achieved in their lifetime, but a more strategic, future-oriented kind of approach. So what I thought was really interesting, and what usually happens in this objectification and representation, is we usually look at the different ways that people perceive the benefits of education. Now, if you analyze these perspectives, you would see that some of the aspirations were very much gendered. For example, they would see education as providing that ability to the girl of being a good mother, raising a good family, of finding a good family to marry in, a good match for themselves. So all of those gendered kind of ideas that we would associate, we would actually see in the perspectives that these women shared. But what was interesting was that at the same time, they would also have this idea of this world that was changing, and through education, giving their daughters a chance at life in which they could actually sustain themselves in a world that was rapidly changing. So the third was also very interesting, in which they spoke about how the education could actually bring a choice in their lives. Now, usually when we speak with women, this comes across very frequently, where women talk about financial independence with education and all that. But actually, it's interesting to see hidden in the narratives of these voiced sort of aspirations is that yearning, that intention of making sure that the daughters become independent. So it's not so much about being financially or being able to earn, but it's more about not having to rely on others, not having to look to others for a lot of things. And this I thought was very interesting, because the same women, for example, even if you analyzed it alongside each other, you would find that women, alongside the gendered aspirations, also held these other aspirations. If only you looked at the narratives and the sort of perspectives that they were trying to share with you, one would realize that there was a whole transformative element to it, where they were looking at even the gendered responsibilities were taken as a strategy, for example, to exist and to be able to sort of flourish in what was available, the resources, if be it gendered ones, available to them. How was it that their daughters could actually make best use of those, and how they were inspired to know how the world was changing, and also to have the choice. When this idea of choice I found was very interesting, because the particular community that I went to, there were quite a few young boys who had went to college and they didn't find any sort of job anywhere. So they ended up working in the fields with their parents as well. So it was really interesting for me to see what was it that they saw, how did they see those opportunities or choice kind of coming by. And I kept asking this question, and it was quite revealing when quite a lot of them said, actually, the choice means that if they don't have this education, the only future that they can ever have is that of being in the family, maybe having to rely on others, for every single thing, for necessities of life. What happens if, the marriage doesn't work? They're left at the mercy of the community then. And they said that with education, they have that one alternative, it's either that or the other element where they could actually become independent. And if things fall into place, they might have that opportunity. So they knew that the likelihood was the likelihood wasn't as much, but even then they were very much invested in making this possible based on that. So I think that was really interesting, because it wasn't like they were naive and they didn't understand their situations, but actually, it was very strategic and very important. So if on the face of it we looked at for example, the gendered aspirations, and a lot of things that they said, you would hear, the impact of global capitalism and neoliberalism. You could also see, meritocracy and all of those issues. But it is only until you legitimize people as seriously having the ability of creating something grand, like a theory, which is most relevant to their circumstances and maybe in the circumstances of other women who live in similar situations, then we would be able to see and explore all of these options and their own theories and philosophies of dealing with that circumstance, with that context, and with that micro and macro change that was happening in the context. So with this, like I said, these are just developing thoughts, and they're not well formed or formulated thoughts at all. But I just wanted to talk about that, and I just wanted to end with a few questions that I find quite insightful. For example, Bruce John says, is the creation of theory only possible in hospitable places and conditions, like I discussed? And if they are, and there are certain places, for example, women living in circumstances of oppression or being oppressed, then why are certain theoretical frameworks still seen as very grand? And I really like the way that Bell Hooks actually talks about Freire's idea of when you need to observe transformation and when you need to engage in transformation, you can't enter the struggle as an object, hoping to become a subject as you engage with that transformation, but actually you need to be seen as a subject, and you need to enter the struggle as a subject. And I think for her also, there is that element of, that internal element of struggle being seen as those that are involved in that struggle per se. And I just wanted to end by saying that Meena Das's idea, can theory be generated in the weave of daily life? And then eventually, does a Pakistani mother in a rural community have the right to theorize? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Aliya, for such an interesting presentation. I'll give now a chance to Monique, our discussant today, to take the floor. But before that, there's a chat box. I think you're right. So it's open for everyone to drop the questions, or if you have a comment in the chat box. But towards the end, I think after Monique's reaction, then definitely open up the floor to all participants. Monique, it's your time.
First of all, before this presentation, Aliya and I were talking, and I was nervous about what am I going to respond to? And then in the course of your presentation, I realized, oh yeah, our research was so similar. So at least that calmed me down a bit. I wanted to first of all say thank you for starting off with dispelling the idea that we even need to be heroic, and the notion of being superwoman, and that has been pervasive in our culture, especially that I feel has been promoted in a capitalist warping of the feminist movement. I also liked how I saw relation with your research and how you questioned, okay, so what will be defined as heroism and what will be defined as these women's agency and what they're able to do, theorizing in this context. And that's how I saw it, because that's what I have also found in my own research, my study of African feminisms, and how it constantly has to remind people that, well, although what is perceived, the questioning of somebody being feminist, or somebody being a theorist, or somebody being having agency, is always, if it's not overt, if there wasn't an event of burning bras, then it wasn't feminism. But in our African feminism, in most post-colonial feminist scholarship, they're saying it doesn't need to be overt. We can use different methods negotiating in our context, and that is still valid. All the ways we express our agency is still valid. And as long as we achieve our aims. And so there's a particular quote I remember I've just used in a recent book review that stands out for me. And the quote says, the quote is by Mahmoud, and 2005 work, and he says, if the ability to effect change in the world and in oneself is historically and culturally specific, both in terms of what constitutes as change and the means by which it is affected, then the meaning and the sense of agency, like theorizing, cannot be fixed in advance, but must emerge through analysis of particular concepts, particular contexts that enable modes of being. In this sense, agentival capacity is entailed by not only those acts that resist norms, but also in the multiple ways in which one inhabits their norms. And I think that's actually what came across as she was speaking, that these women did this in very different ways. And I appreciate that. So thank you. But you also, as we discuss this, as we theorize this, I also have to say, this is also a problem that we must address in post-colonial feminist theories and perspectives. And that, okay, we can say that these women theorize in different ways, and we can say that these women express their agency and express their empowerment, express their feminism in multiple different ways, and that those alternative ways are valid. However, there's a question of, so to what extent can we say they're full of agency or feminist or empowered, or that their theories are sound, given that there's always a but, such as where you, and the but I saw here is where they're expressing their aspirations. Although they want to equip, they're expressing their theorizing, they're expressing their agency in the way they're supporting their daughter's dreams, ability to change, to cope in this changing context, and to take up different positions in future. They still have the aspiration for them, for their, they still have the desire, they still have the aspiration for their daughters to continue in designated gender roles. So you see now, you start wondering, okay, so yes, they're expressing some agency, but there's also this but. So will there also be a limit to which they'll say, okay, I want her to have a job, but she should also be able to do this? And how do we discuss that? How do we factor that in? Like respecting the fact that alternative viewpoints, alternative forms of agency, but then there is this but. So thank you. That's actually what was going through my mind as you were discussing. I'm going to put the quote in the chat box.
Okay, thanks, Monique, for that sharing. I think for now, I can open up to everyone. If you have a question, I think you can raise your hand. I'll recognize you. Or if you have a comment, and I think you can just drop it in the chat box. So you're most welcome to react to the two presenters.
I was wondering if I could respond to Monique's comments.
Yeah, sure, definitely. You can. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Monique. I mean, sometimes I say that working with women on issues of gender is such a heavy thing to do, because at times it keeps you up at night. I still remember when I was analyzing my data, when I was, and again, calling it data is a very reductive kind of idea of the work that we do by nature of what we do. And I think it's a heavy burden. And I think there is no way that you can do something perfectly, for example. And there is always a risk. So for example, you could tread the line where you could just talk about these things disconnected from the broader politics. for example, the histories, the ways in which the rights of these women have actually been negated. So all of those things. And then the silent perspective of, the inherent effects of such a context and such historic conditions of oppression that end up them having to, aspire for a gendered role, for example, the but that you talked about, right? So it's a very sensitive line. And I think as a researcher, and I sometimes wonder when I started my career as a researcher, I was not aware the kind of responsibility that I would have and the things that I would have to own up to, the mistakes that I will actually make. But having said that, I mean, my approach is always to, as a researcher, look at the broader politics as well. But I always believe, I think perhaps, especially in terms of Islamic feminism and Muslim women's issues, and the way in international education, the way that they are perceived, the way that they're represented, my stress has always been on looking at the specific. But at the same time, it doesn't mean that the social justice and the elements coming from therein do not need to be considered. That's another fight that needs to run parallel to these things. Now, your point about the aspirations of becoming a good mother, for example, that was very interesting because for them, it seemed like there were two alternatives. One was either they become a mother, either they get married. The other was maybe there could be an alternative future if things just fall into place, they might become independent, they might be able to do things differently. So that wasn't multiple perspectives, but actually one alternative. So the way, and when you looked at these mothers who very strongly talked about these other two categories, they also talked about the gendered roles. So, and when you think about that, the mother, the choosing of the house, a comfortable family, a family where they could actually do certain things, you would realize that in a sense, if in their mind, and that still remains a question, that was one alternative, then is it that they were choosing the lesser evil in that alternative? To say, I mean, because the value of the girl would definitely increase if she had some sort of education. And it was really interesting how the mother said that even if the boy is not educated, they would still expect and want to get a girl that has some education because of the social prestige that comes with education. So I completely agree with you. It is something that I agree I will never do the exact right thing. There will always be mistakes. And when I say something, I will always use up the voice or maybe the right of some other kind of struggle of another woman, perhaps in the same context. But I guess this is the burden that I've taken up on myself, and I should own up to the mistakes that I'll make in the process. Thank you.
Oh, I don't think it's a mistake of yours personally. I think it's more like our theorizing of all of us in post-colonial feminist theory, our theorizing of neo-feminism, when we're trying to say this is valid and this is correct, we have this question, this looming thing hanging over our heads. But then if it's not overt, how are you sure? Are you sure you're not guessing? To what extent are they actually feminist? So it's something that we always have to respond to. Thank you. Oh, and I just want to clarify, perhaps for those who, because I typically ask this question, your feminist theory that you use in your research is Islamic feminist theory, right? Or was it Black Islamic feminist?
So Islamic feminism, but I see a lot of value in Black feminism, that I think there are so many things that they've said so nicely because of the struggles they have gone through, that I think there's lots of value in that. So I can't fit myself into Islamic feminism or Black feminism, but I see value in all of these perspectives.
I think there's a question for you in the chat.
Yeah, there's one question from Ntimi. I think he says the patriarchal and colonial lens are indeed distorting lens as they do locate women as custodians of their narratives about life, lived experience. So he says you do suggest, of course, the decolonial approach. Probably, could you please say more about this and how practical it is in the context such as Pakistan? And then afterward, I think there's a hand from Prof. Manning. Maybe we can take that after you respond to this one.
Sorry, I'm just reading through the question. Yeah, thank you so much. This is such a brilliant question. I was wondering if you could actually, ask the question yourself, or do you want me to respond? I mean, the conversation becomes more alive when you're interacting, or otherwise I can just respond. So I think the way that I definitely use a decolonial angle, and I always understand decolonial, and I have sometimes questions about the sort of the terminologies that we used for different contexts. For example, just like Carmen's and Melanie's work, because there are questions about, as long as there will be masculinity, even if toxic masculinity, there will be an opposite femininity, and how do we describe masculinity with respect to femininity? So as long as these terminologies remain, they will be associated with certain bodies and certain kinds of people. Similarly, for me, decolonial is very much challenging the perspectives that they actually are living within. But then challenge is also a very interesting thing. For example, I would argue that these women do take control of their lives, or at least through the alternative futures in those contexts, by being more strategic, or by navigating the space that they are there present therein. Now, with the Islamic kind of element, because of the importance of honor and the importance of other elements of a little bit of docility in certain contexts, it is usually, I believe, that too big a sort of an expectation from a woman in a particular context to be more radical about what she says. And in my sense, then, she is decolonizing her own context by imagining these futures and facilitating different kinds of ways in which these situations can be transformed. And I always feel that this terminology of resistance is also a little bit problematic, because on the face of it, they seem to be, abiding by all of those norms. But if you look at their narratives, if you spend time with them, if you've been that woman at a particular point in your life, you would see that there is more happening, and there's more of a consciousness, a praxis within which they are locating themselves. So in that sense, I would see this as a decolonial move, but perhaps not in the radical sense, but in a more strategic sense. I'm wondering if I got your question correctly and if I've answered that. If not, please do feel free to, correct me. Thank you.
Okay, I think if there is a follow-up question, Tim will always come back. But now let me recognize Prof. Melanie. I think you can have the floor.
Thanks very much, Chimwemwe, and Aliya, thank you for a very interesting paper. It's quite dense and rich, so I'm hearing it for the first time. So I think I'd need to look at the text quite carefully to try and get a grip of the arguments. So I'm going to make one comment and then attempt a question. So the comment is in response to Jance's question about, is the creation of theory only possible in hospitable places and conditions? And the answer is obviously no, because some of the most powerful theory we've had has come from people like Fanon, Steve Biko in South Africa, and indeed Freire. So working initially in a politically hospitable environment in Brazil before the dictatorship took over in 1964, but going out into peasant communities where there was widespread illiteracy and so on. So it seems to me actually it's rather the opposite of what he's saying. So perhaps very West-centric, very a particular kind of philosophical theory only happens in those sorts of places. But in terms of thinking about the kind of theories which move us on for transformation and change, I think they come from inhospitable places. And your research is located in an inhospitable place. So I guess that there's potential there. What I'm less clear on or couldn't quite grasp through the presentation is how the theorizing works. I mean, I sort of understand it at one level, so I'm trying not to be reductive about this. And I understand that really you're making an argument for complexity and a multidimensionality of understanding, because at one level one can argue, but there's a way in which your findings still play into that dominant development aid narrative, because the women are still prioritizing these kinds of things for their daughters. And if you strip out the complexities, the multidimensionalities, the nuances of agency, yeah, sure, you can still make that argument, which is not the one that you're making. So I was reminded in your presentation of Appadurai's work on the right to research, which also includes the right to theorizing, which he very much locates in the context of the everyday, the ordinary, in which people think about their lives and are able to perfectly understand their lives and how they might need to be different. But then my question is, well, two things. You know, what does everyday theorizing look like, and how do we know how will we recognize it when we come across it? But also the gap, or the difference, actually, perhaps rather than the gap, between that sort of everyday theorizing and the kind of work that we then do in the academy, and then the slippage that then happens. So it's, you know, who ends up doing the theorizing at a different level, and who owns it, and who gets to write about it, and who gets to have their voice heard. So there's that slippage. So it's very important to say theorizing has this everyday element, and these women are doing it and people are doing it, but whose theorizing gets to be heard, as it were. So if you can comment on the gap and the slippage there. And then the final thing I want to say, sorry, this is a bit all over the place. In the Hooks quote, she talks about, in relation to this theorizing, she talks about a process of collective liberation. So how would you see what you're describing as also potentially or not a process of collective liberation? I hope that makes sense, but it's a very rich paper, so I'm kind of doing my best here.
Thank you, Melanie. Perhaps it's seeming like rich because it's disconnected and still in very initial stages, but thank you for insightful questions as usual. And I completely agree with you. And in a sense, when I was thinking about your second one, about the gaps in theorizing, I just saw the big sort of hole in the paper, thinking that again, the task comes to the researcher, right? Again, the researcher is the one who will need to engage with these people. And I guess that brings me back to some of the thinking that I've been doing of myself as a researcher, and of the harms and of the complexities therein. But in a sense that, you know, when, at least from the Western academy, and I really value people who deeply engage in sort of feminist thought, Black feminist thought, especially transnational feminism, Islamic feminism, because their questions are more rooted in, you know, the self, and how do you become that bridge between that theorist and that context. And I often think about, you know, in order for me to legitimize my work, I do need to either use methods that may not come up to the hierarchy of, for example, you know, methods like creative arts based, you know, literary methods, to then draw on these experiences and again fall down on the hierarchy of, you know, solid sort of evidence and things that are taken seriously, you know, the generalizability or the translatability of the things that I'm talking about. So in a sense, if I come from that academy that does not allow me to remain open to these things and to engage with the context, thinking that there is something that will come back, that will surprise me, that will, you know, poke holes in the way that I think the academy is structured. So that has always then led me to think about the politics of knowledge production. And that brings me to the first comment that you had. For example, you know, his question, are there hospitable places, is very Western centric, but it is also there because from the other side, things don't come in. So all the hospitable places have been located in certain parts of the world, and all the theory has been generated from there, whereas there are other inhospitable places. So for example, if Freire didn't go to Pakistan and he had no opportunity of speaking with, and this is something that I say usually, women in rural Pakistan, does it mean that theory is not happening there? And if that is the case, then do we need to acknowledge that as theorists or as researchers, we're carriers of this, so, you know, like the pigeons who carry messages from here to there, but how do we approach this? Now, with this comes the complexity of, you know, how do you differentiate between what's happening on ground, for example, and us who have to abide by certain rules to say, now this is theory happening. It has to, you know, have that criteria that we can take, and therefore this will be seen as theory. I guess that is the bigger question that feminist work is grappling with at the moment. You know, all those questions about feminisms, of that diversity, of not being able to understand. And I think eventually the academe will find its foundations to be weakening because the world has started changing more rapidly than we thought it would. And because everything, so for example, COVID just, turned everything on its head, because all the inequalities that were already there, we knew they were there, they're so starkly indivisible that there are questions around that. So I guess eventually that complexity and that move away from what we thought was so clear and so analytical and so easy to follow will probably fall apart. Now, I have no answer to this, but my only idea is whether or not, there should be some basic ideals like the ones we have for social justice, but usually in capability, for example, they lead to legal frameworks that are, again, very reductionist and very have to be, by virtue of what they do, they have to be like that. So how do we devise a way of perhaps approaching that as an ideal, as an umbrella in which we engage in the world in a way that we minimize ourselves and the academe in a very sincere way? So, for example, even a lot of self-critical work or critical reflexivity comes from a glorification of the self in the process, for example. So I guess these are ethical questions that I don't have any answers to, but kind of considerations that I have in my mind. And about collective liberation, that is a very interesting question. And I always tend to focus on the specific and not taking the collective in mind. But somehow, when you move around in these communities, you tend to see that there are similar things happening, and under the cover, they're connected. Even though they might not be meeting like in a group, in a society kind of meeting, they may not be collecting with a manifesto in their mind, there are thinking that is, so you can see that moving around in those spaces. Sometimes I use the analogy of, for example, when we had Charlotte Bronte and she wrote her work, and I usually discuss that too, and she talks about Jane Eyre, and usually that work is valued because it seemed to be well ahead of its time. But Charlotte Bronte did live in a society. She did live with a group of people. Probably she connected with women, or she must have lived in a community with women that had similar issues. And they must have talked about these issues in their privacy. They must have said that, I don't like to be excluded like that. But we somehow understand that suddenly a brain conjures something and then something just materializes. But we undervalue that social process that might be happening there. And that always leads me again to those overt kind of, expectations of performance, of being radical, which is extremely important. And without that radical turn, things would now not have been similar for women and their rights as they are today. But, not to disregard what happens in those societies. So Charlotte Bronte didn't exist in a vacuum. She must have spoken to people. She had a sister who also did similar things. But we somehow look at her work in isolation with the society and we say she was ahead of her time, as if there's something, unique about that particular person. Yeah. So again, no answers, Melanie. I never have answers for your questions, but just my thoughts.
Thanks, that's great. Let us know when there's a paper that we can look at and chew over.
Okay, it seems of time, but there's one question I think in the chat box. I'm not sure if you can attempt that from Dr. Mikateko. And then probably that will be the last question for the day.
Yeah, I'll just quickly speak over it while you're going through it, Aliya. And it was just to ask you to kind of take us through some of the complexities of judging for oneself or for another, particularly in a mother-daughter type of relationship, as you would have examples from your own empirical data, the extent to which you're able to, and who gets to make the judgment about women's aspirations being realistic. And I'm looking at the word realistic, obviously keeping in mind that often that aspiring has to happen and the imagining has to happen within a way that kind of goes beyond what is immediately possible or obviously achievable. And if you have examples from your own data about the complexities of how that judgment is made and who gets to make it. Thanks.
Thank you, Mikateko. So another very difficult question, but very important one as well. So again, that judgment, eventually, if you look at it, that was made by me, because obviously the women weren't there when they were analyzing. But I think that judgment actually came from a lot of discomfort, a lot of ignorance, because I think I was truly taken aback by what I saw happening. And in a sense, probably I could kind of not at all claim to be an insider, but kind of understand, because I grew up so I knew I had shared some of the cultural experiences, and therefore there was some level of understanding there. But obviously I think the decisions were taken by me, and therefore again, I can't, which is why I never say, voicing people's concerns or giving voice to certain people, because that will never be somebody's voice. It will always be your voice and the things that you actually choose. So the decisions were taken by me. But I think the way that I also kind of engage critically with my own thinking is, that banking, I think bracketing in phenomenological research, when you bracket, when you find an opposite answer to everything that you say. Now, when I came back, I was really taken. I had no idea how to make sense of what was happening. So I just did not understand, because the situation seemed so dire. There were no opportunities, nothing was happening. Everything was so unrealistic on things they were saying. But, the way that they said it, the things that they actually said, the stories they told me, it's usually when you're in their presence, the glimmer in their eyes, the excitement, having something taken away, then suddenly thinking about another alternative to actually make things possible. That was really dismantling. I just could not make sense of it. And I remember when I came back, I just didn't know any way of making sense of what they were saying. It was an instinct that there was something else happening beyond what I was seeing, but I couldn't make sense of it. And I think a lot of things actually kind of fall into place. I remember there was, because, I was once with my daughter, and she said, so she plays basketball, and I usually give this example. And she came back and she said, I had a lot of fun. Our team actually lost the match. And I said, okay. She said, because she's a good player, she said, I had the opportunity of choosing. And I chose the team that I knew didn't have very good players. And eventually we lost, but I'm really happy. And I said, why would you, like, a child would actually go ahead she's a teenager, for a stronger team so that she can win. And she said something to me, and she said, sometimes it's more important to have the opportunity to play and even lose at the end, rather than not having the chance to play but win. So I guess, a lot of things made me think about, what do we understand outcomes to be, and how do we understand them to be, and what is that play for a person, and how does that encourage them? So again, all of these frameworks came from a very different context, me being situated here, my daughter having the ability to play in a team, for example. And of course, that Western-centric ideas are in my mind. But I guess one of the things that I try and do even in my teaching is make the researcher visible. The person who's behind that text, making the person visible, to expose them, to say that, we are here, we are making these decisions. And that doesn't say that we're coming up with some, and which is why I'm really, cautious. One of my earlier submitted works actually talks about a framework, which I'm quite conscious about, because there can never be a fixed kind of way of analyzing things. It will always have to be more sort of dynamic and changing. And Mekateko, I know this is not an answer to your question, but just something that I can just acknowledge and say, these were my decisions at the end of the day, as much as I interacted with them, but I worked around a lot of instinct.
Okay, thanks so much. I think we are almost 3 minutes after the allocated 1 hour, so I think we can call it a day from now. Thanks so much. Anyway, before I say that, let me also just recognize, I think, some of the comments in the chat box. I think there was one from Tiffany. I may not read it, but I think all of us might have followed her line of argument there. So thanks for the comment. I think thanks, Aliya, for the presentation, and also how you have engaged, I think, with various questions that came after, but also the comments from the participants. I think it's quite thought-provoking, and I'm sure the lines of communication are still open beyond this this forum. Would wish to have you back, of course, here next time, and also thanks to all the participants, I think, for really providing some concrete feedback and also engaging with the presentation. That was very, very wonderful. Finally, let me also thank Monique for organizing the DBT. And yeah, to everyone for the day.
Thank you so much. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, so I think we can call it a day for now, and wish you all the best for the rest of the day.
Great.
Thank you. I just wanted to thank you, and also to say it would be a dream come true to be there. I mean, and to be asked such difficult questions that I really sweat and I think about, and then I try to answer and I stumble here and there. So thank you so much for such brilliant questions and such brilliant
Thanks,
audience.
Aliya.
Really
See you soon, hopefully.
hopefully, yes. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Anyway.